As a child, there are books that you never forget. Caps for Sale and Ferdinand, they immediately come to mind. Oh, the Richard Scarry book, What Do People Do All Day? I love that one. I still giggle when I think of the pencil car driven by two mice or the pickle car with a mouse at the wheel. These books are part of how we see the world. And for my own children, we introduce them to so many stories. But today I want to highlight Lottie's New Beach Towel by Petra Mathers. Petra died this week, and it makes me really sad. But in this moment, I want to thank her. I want to thank her for Lottie and her friend Herbie. I want to thank her for the creative ways that she approached problems and found ways to solve them. Or sometimes she just was simply present. Lottie was just a compassionate presence for those in her circle. And I think Petra would have been fans of my guests, Graig Meyer and Jamie Almanzán. Both are smart, they're funny, they're creative, and they're mindful of the needs of others. Now, in today's episode, in the first part, we talk about the delicate handling of equity work in conservative communities. And in part two, I want you to imagine this, that you have been asked to give the beginning of the year kickoff to 1,000 teachers. And so there are 1,000 teachers in this room who may have been told that they're the obstacle to equitable practices. And what no one told you is that contract negotiations have not been going well, and the teachers have threatened to walk out. Okay, imagine all of that, and they say, and now you're on. Oh, let me also apologize in advance. I clearly forgot to turn on my mic, so I sound as if I'm down a well. But Graig and Jamie, they sound amazing. So you'll hear more of them than you'll hear me. I'm Peter Stiepelman, and this is an Imperfect Leader.
Today on An Imperfect Leader, we are doing something new and exciting. Instead of having a conversation with just one leader in the educational space, I have asked two individuals, Graig Meyer and Jamie Almanzán, to join us in a conversation about schools and leadership, and it's going to be great. So both Graig and Jamie are leaders at the Equity Collaborative in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And Jamie is the founder, and Graig is the organization's chief operating officer. And I'm just so excited to have them here today. And it turns out we have some mutual friends like Bren Elliott in Washington, D.C., episode 49, if I'm not mistaken. You should go check her out. But Graig and Jamie, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Nice to be here. Glad
to be here. Excited. Glad to follow up on Bren Elliott.
That's awesome. Well, I've been really looking forward to talking with you both. Earlier this year, I read your piece, The Delicate Handling of Equity Work in Conservative Communities. And in the 2 years since I've left the superintendency, I have found myself talking with superintendents who have faced or are facing this dilemma. They recognize they have a responsibility to prepare children for an unpredictable and ever-changing world. And what we both, or all three of us, know is what is predictable for them is the importance of their children learning about systems of oppression. And their communities sometimes see that any topic, really, of equity as an assault, potentially, on their traditions. Or one example from your article, that they say that superintendents are bringing critical race theory to their community when they're really talking about equity. So my first question for you, would you just tell me a little bit about the leaders you interviewed for that article, what advice you continue to give leaders in all communities about approaching equity work, particularly those who are living in conservative communities?
So I thought we would maybe split this up a little bit because we interviewed two superintendents for this piece. Three superintendents, Pulaski. I thought I would talk a little bit about Andy Gardner, who comes from North Sanium, which is close to Salem in Oregon, and now is the superintendent in Albany schools, or Greater Albany Public Schools. And then I thought Graig might talk a little bit about Michelle Caulfield, given that he has been the primary and working up in Corning, New York.
Great, let's go.
Okay. So we partnered with Andy actually almost right at the beginning of the pandemic. And what Andy wanted to do was do some qualitative research. He wanted to basically have us run some qualitative assessments to better understand what were some of the experiential gaps for pretty much anyone in the North Sanium School District. So we ended up interviewing staff, parents, a staff of everyone, certificated, classified, etc., board members, and then students. And we've done this before where we run a lot of focus groups. We set up a set of questions that basically are similar for all the groups. And then we try to compare what people say, find some themes in the data and identify, here's are some of the things that are standing out. And in that, what one of the key findings was that students of color in North Sanium weren't having the same experience as their white counterparts in this district. This is a small town, and when we brought that to the board and to the staff, basically this is the first thing that I'd say that happens in what I would describe as a sort of a split board. There's, conservative members and liberal members, and that's not what they wanted for the students that attend their schools. That one of the first commonalities was kids shouldn't have to endure racial slurs. That's not okay. And that wasn't broken down by political lines. Parents didn't find that to be okay, whether they were white parents or the parents of color of the kids that were experiencing that. And so it was sort of like, that was one of the drivers that ended up causing the work to go forward. And I think Graig and I will both talk about this, that using that kind of data in conjunction with quantitative data that shows, where kids aren't doing as well in some of the quantitative measures, helped teachers better understand, like, do you think that the experience that they're having in school could be having a negative impact on their ability to read?
So that's so interesting. So what I think I hear you saying is, like, instead of talking about potentially starting with the discrepancies in terms of quantitative, you're saying, where do we have common ground in terms of just children feeling valued and honored at school? And when their experiences yield
Yes.
that racial slurs everyone can agree in terms of common ground that that's not okay. And
Yes.
then that became a springboard for subsequent conversations around, well, when that happens, how does that impact learning?
100%, which then led to a conversation at the board level, basically, that said, well, what does impact it? How does that impact the classroom? And then they ended up looking at literacy scores, and there's a gap. And there's a gap in terms of literacy at the younger levels, and follows kids, particularly Latino students in their district, all the way through. And they said, well, we don't want that to be true either. Shouldn't kids be able to read as a result of going to school? And I love that story. And Andy was the person who was always saying sort of like, we need to get you guys in front of everyone. There isn't any group that should not have access to the conversation. And that's exactly what we believe. We believe that no public system, no public school is filled with people who are trying to make sure kids have a bad experience or do poorly. Like every teacher in that district is working their butt off. And so that it completely shifted. Like, it shifted how they approach the conversation. Equity no longer became about anything, any boogeyman or anything like that. It was like, no, actually, we're doing equity by trying to teach every kid to read. It means that what we've been doing in the past hasn't necessarily been working.
I'm going to shift us to Graig. So Graig, tell us about the work that you were doing with the school.
I mean, to pick up where y'all are and to think about this example of Michelle Caulfield in Corning, New York, so a very different environment, upstate New York. We did a similar assessment to what Jamie said. And one of the things that we observed was that the school district had a slogan that was, students are at the center of all we do. And that's a great slogan for a school district. But what the assessment showed was like, actually, students are not at the center of all you do. And in fact, where your inequities show up, it's largely because you're prioritizing adults over students. And that's not to say, as Jamie pointed out, that the adults aren't doing the best job they possibly can, but it's just you're making decisions based on, what the union negotiated for, or what the adults are afraid to take on, or whatever it is, rather than what's best for kids. And holding that up to them as a mirror to look at their data, to look at their student experience, it helped the board and the superintendent realize, like, we actually have to reorient ourselves. And public schools, the word public means everybody. So when you have this orientation, this is who we want to support, then it's inherent in your mission of how do we be inclusive. But inclusive and unequitable isn't fully fulfilling the mission of schools either. Michelle Caulfield's leadership there has been to keep people highly focused on that one specific tagline of students are at the center of all we do, and make sure that they have very clear policies that they will hold everyone accountable to make sure that every kid is getting what they need, that every kid is included. And now in the last couple of years where they've had pushback from some folks in the contemporary era of pushing back on LGBTQ issues in particular in that district, she has the groundwork where she's been able to say, our schools are a place for everyone. That includes your children, even if you are uncomfortable with how we approach LGBTQ children. But here's what the policies are that set the ground for everyone to participate here. Michelle is very direct in saying we have a policy on this is what it means to have student-initiated clubs, and how you get a faculty advisor to have your club and what you have to do to sustain the club. And if you're eligible to have that club, you're eligible and we're going to make space for you. And so we have a queer straight alliance that meets in the same place as the Christian club meets the day after. The one thing you can't do with either club, because it's a public school, is you can't exclude people. So if you want to show up and participate, you're welcome to show up. And the expectation then is that you're going to show up for the purpose of that club being convened, not to disrupt it or whatever, because then there's a whole other way that we talk about how do we deal with students getting along with each other in schools and behavior, conduct, et cetera. But it's the same when we work with schools on racial affinity groups to support kids of color with navigating, being in a predominantly white environment, for instance. You have a African-American student organization. Absolutely, white kids can show up. They just need to understand that when you show up, the purpose of this club is to support Black identity. And if you want to be there, you will probably learn from that and benefit and have a great time. And the Black kids makes me think to be there, but you're on their space.
Yeah, well, that makes me think about your comment earlier about adult issue versus kid issue. Most of the time, what I've observed in these clubs is that the clubs will actually cross over to other clubs and do things together. Right? We're going to go clean up the park together, our two clubs. Whereas adult issues are really about striking a very binary sort of ones and zeros on what club should be. It should only be for a sport, or it should only be for a key club, or it should only be for as opposed to what our kids truly are. Yeah, they look for lots of opportunities to sort of express themselves.
One of the dumbest things in the contemporary political debate about equity and inclusion in schools is when adults look at something like a gay-straight alliance or a Hispanic student alliance or whatever it is, and they see that as an example that those kids want to be excluded. And they say, well, we shouldn't set up exclusive environments. Like, that is so backwards to just talking to the kids. The kids set it up so that they can create an environment that helps them figure out how they can be better included in the school when the adults in the school have not created the space that they want to just be themselves. So the kids are they're creating it to have a more inclusive environment to get the support that they need. Then they're going to do exactly what you just said, Peter, which is they're going to say, well, we got our group together. Now let's go work with this other group, because that's how you build an inclusive identity. You do it across difference.
Yep. They're really modeling. In a book I recently wrote, I tell the story about a Midwest community. And actually, for the context here, the year is 1946. So World War II has just ended. And so I'll just read just a brief part, because I really want your thoughts on how you do this work with other systems, because it's looking at your past to sort of inform your present to do a better future. And so here it is. It's the superintendent at the time had led the school district for 16 years until 1962. And his successor served the next 14 years until his retirement in 1976. So these two leaders led the school district during a significant period in the nation's history. World War II had just ended, the Korean War was on the horizon, and in Brown versus the Board of Education versus Topeka, the Supreme Court decided separate but equal was most definitely not constitutional. Following the court's ruling, the superintendent faced pushback from the community. Families at an elementary school protested when their school had to accept 11 African American children. And in fact, the parents at that school canceled their annual chili supper because they feared African American parents would plan to attend as well. And a meeting was held with the NAACP president, who agreed to recommend to the Black families involved that they not attend the chili supper. So that elementary school today actually retains this exclusive enrollment as a lottery school. And while located in an African American neighborhood, children must take a bus to another school. It's a crazy story, but one that's not unfamiliar, I imagine, to the Equity Collaborative. And I read in your treasure trove of amazing blog posts. So I will put a link in the show notes because there's so many rich examples. But there's this important lesson of looking critically at your systems for evidence of inequity that they create. And so my question is, what are ways that you help leaders sort of lift the hood on their systems and really look at them and critically through an equity lens?
And one element that's present in your story is we do think that it's important that if you're going to understand the system, you have to understand the history that leads to it being a system. It's part of how you end up with well-intentioned individuals. Every single person that goes to work in public schools wants to support all kids. Nobody goes in to hurt kids. But how do you end up with an inequitable system from well-intentioned individuals? Well, part of it is the system has a lot of historical stuff before you showed up that you're stuck in. And generally, educators hate that stuff. They know what it is. They just don't know how to change it. But, your example is a single school. Your example happened in the entire state of Virginia in an era called massive resistance that I would encourage people to look up, where white parents decided to shut down the entire public school system instead of integrating. And then they created the nation's first voucher program. And then they physically went into the schools and they stripped out the desks and the books and the football goalposts. And they took them to the new private schools that they set up so their kids wouldn't have to go to school with Black kids. So with our third superintendent, Kevin Sears, who was superintendent in Pulaski, Virginia, he's still dealing with the legacy of that and how parents think and how some of them were raised today. And unfortunately, in that school district, like we give you two good examples that we started with, Kevin ended up leaving that district at the end of last year. And he texted me this week after this year's elections. And he said he was really sad to tell me that all the board members that I had worked with have been voted off the board because there was a complete flip to a conservative anti-equity board who ran explicitly on a campaign of saying we should not have a diverse and inclusive environment. So the history isn't history in that district. It's today.
Still today.
Yeah. You can sense my silence sort of being, I'm asking like, how do you lift up the hood? And you're going, yeah, well, those situations are still here today. And I guess then my follow-up question would be, when we think about nudging or agitating for change, what you're just describing is that systems will work aggressively to get back to status quo, right? I mean, you're talking 50 years or more of change that is not willing to make appropriate change. So what happens when you're in a district like that? I mean, what do you do? Other than leave, because it's for your own personal health, right? In terms of, you wait until the moment is right again to approach them again.
Yeah. That makes me think of the idea around equity work that happens sometimes. And then this is with districts that actually want to do equity work. So I'm going to flip it real quick for a moment. But as they do it, there's sometimes hardliners around equity work that say, well, if you're not going to get on the bus, then we're going to leave you behind. That is not our approach at all. Our approach is that to do equity work in a public system for every kid, the bus needs to keep coming around every single time. And if the person refuses to get on the bus and they're still at the bus stop, you swing back around over and over.
Oh, you treat it like a transit system. Don't worry, we're on a schedule. We'll be back. And yeah. And then maybe the answer is, and I can't remember his Richard Milner, right? Who wrote, meet people where they are, but don't stay there kind of thing. Or, and so maybe that's what it is. It's that you just keep driving around, you open the door, you getting on? Oh, not today. We'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Our saying is that systems change when people change. So the system will change when the first group of people start to change. But you come back for the next group of people and the next group of people. And one thing that a lot of equity work gets wrong is that they start by focusing on the least likely group of people, and they burn a ton of energy on trying to figure out, well, how do we deal with these people that are resistors? When actually what we know about change theory is what you need to do is start with your folks who are most likely to join you and build momentum. And some of those 100%. People will come along because they'll be like, oh, now I'm not so afraid of it because my questions have been answered and I see how it works and I might actually like it better.
Yeah. And, that group of individuals often have a real sense of urgency. And so then it's on the leader to remind them that, like, we want to maintain and keep that that fire burning and recognize that it's going to slow down and there's going to be like the storming and the tension. And then you're talking about all these clubs of all these kids who are doing amazing work. And sadly, it's really thinking it's the next generation, unfortunately, that's going to then say, what, are you crazy? Of course we're going to do this work because they were raised in it. Whereas you're combating mental models of what these individuals are bringing, those resistors, they have a very strong mental model that is not easily, it's fossilized to some extent.
Exactly. And if you're an education leader, your job is not to educate children. Your job is to support adults to change so that they're better at educating children.
I think that gets lost all the time, constantly. That as a principal, when you interview principals and they say, "Oh, I love this job because of the kids," I'm like, "Well, then how come you're not teaching?" Because that would get you closer to kids. And usually, it's because I don't know. I was encouraged to take this job.
I know exactly. That's right. Everybody looked around, and I was the last one standing in the room, or I was the last one to arrive at the meeting.
Correct.
Oh, you're principal now. You're the principal.
And it turns out your job isn't the kids.
No, I know.
Your job is all of the adults that surround the kids and support the kids.
Yeah.
And that's a hard shift for many folks who haven't, because kids, honestly, the systems change when people change. If the kids were in charge, our system would be significantly better because they change faster.
Let me ask you both a question in maybe 20 seconds or less. Because I really want to get to segment 2 where we talk about a decision that you made and what you learned from it. But I always ask my guests, what does an imperfect leader mean to you? So Graig, let's start with you. What does it mean to you?
So I love the title of your podcast, your book, because one of the things that we talk about all the time is that the only people you find in this work are imperfect allies. This is not about who's got it. And especially speaking as a white person, the times that I failed most in my own ability to be a strong leader for equity were the times where I felt like there was a way to be the good white person, and then I'd end up falling flat on my face. And luckily, I had people who cared enough about me and for me, including lots of Black women, who would say, "Hey, you screwed up, and that actually hurt my feelings, and I'm really disappointed, and I need you to do better." And I had to be humble enough to say, "I'm sorry. And how should I have done it differently?"
Awesome. Jamie, what about for you?
I mean, I fully agree with Graig. The name of the podcast is our entire approach that if you think you're the smartest person in the room is when you're going to fall on your face. Being humble in leadership is the trait in which that we lean into consistently. It makes me think of my uncle. Has a saying. My uncle who has passed, Roberto Almanzán, used to say, "The cure for the pain is in the pain," and that means that you have to be bad at You're going to be bad at something, whatever it is, and be bad at it. You're going to have to be bad at it before you're good at it. And our answer is usually, don't be worried that you will say the wrong thing, because I know that you will. If you don't talk about race, you will be bad at talking about race. If you want to get better at talking about race, say the wrong thing for a while, and eventually you won't. And you'll start to say the thing that helps people feel connected and that they belong. That is what it is. But that's why it's imperfect. You're not going to start out good. You don't. No one does.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being. And I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of an imperfect leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR.
Segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership and After Action. And my guests are Graig Meyer and Jamie Almanzán of the Equity Collaborative. And Jamie is the founder, Graig is the organization's chief operating officer. And right now we're going to go into our segment where we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make, and then we discuss it. And since we have 2 guests this week, Graig's going to share his scenario, and Jamie and I are going to kind of poke and talk around the after action questions. So, Graig, what happened?
So recently I came to a school district in a rural community, fairly conservative, and was there to give an opening of school address and workshop. And the superintendent launched the morning and kind of started hinting at that they were in contract negotiations with the teachers union and just how great things were going. And I knew by the way that he talked about it that the union negotiations were not going great. And then he introduced the new district strategic plan, which set up why we were going to be talking about equity that morning. And the superintendent made it pretty clear to the audience that he thought the biggest obstacle to pursuing the strategic plan was going to be the resistance of teachers. And I was like, oh, shoot, I'm about to get on stage.
And ladies and gentlemen, Graig Meyer.
Right. Right. Woo! Here's the other piece of context, Peter. As I looked at the audience of about 1,000 teachers, I only saw 3 people that weren't white. And I'm white, and he was white. And so here's a conversation now that's going to be an equity conversation within that context that also is really in a white room. I knew who the 3 people of color were. They all worked in the district equity office. And so I had to figure out what do I do? And the first thing that I did, we've already talked about today, which is that I told the teachers that I believed that every single one of them got into working in public education for the right reasons. And I knew they cared about every single kid in their school district. And I wanted to reset that frame. And then from there, I tried to make the workshop about talking with folks about ways that pursuing equity work can make the heaviest burdens that they lift into easier burdens, ones where we can actually do this in a way that it's more rewarding to you as a teacher when I know you struggle with the kids who are the most resistant, the most behind, et cetera. But what are the ways that we can approach working with those kids? And not about strategies, but about mindset. A core question for me that gets one level beyond just talking about a kid's racialized experience is what is their family's cultural orientation towards school? In that community, with a whole lot of Latino immigrants, you got a lot of families who crossed the border, left their country because they wanted their kids to have an opportunity, which they saw as education being primary, to reach a level of financial stability and physical safety where their kids would never have to leave their families behind. Wow. That's a powerful motivator for doing well in school. So with that population, that's the one that you're most struggling with in your student performance data, how do we tap into the intrinsic motivation that these families left their own families behind so that their kids could get an education? Yeah.
You're really speaking to the sacrifices that families make for their children, right? And in particular, if you're talking about Latino families, and you know, Jamie, correct me if not that you're a spokesperson for all Latinos, okay? But like, just help me. You're welcome. But it is, you know, there's this reverence for educators, right? You know, God, parents, teacher, and so they not only have sacrificed incredibly, but they also have an expectation that their kid is going to be in such great care with the educators in their lives. And I imagine that can be, I mean, this is the beginning of the year sort of rah-rah meeting that you've been brought into. So, hey, negotiations
first day back from summer break.
They're not going so great. And our strategic plan is fantastic. By the way, you're our biggest resistors, you know, and then Graig, come on in. And then you're talking about something pretty heavy. So looking back at this, what do you see got overlooked?
The big thing that got overlooked is that the superintendent and I weren't on the same page before we went in. I didn't know what he was going to do, and he actually didn't know what I was going to do. And we actually thought we did. We thought we had done adequate planning, but we didn't. And I don't think that he connected the dots of kind of the way that the union negotiations were going to be related. And he didn't tell me until afterwards that the union had actually threatened the day before to walk out of the event for something totally unrelated to equity. And so there was communication that was missed that could have put us in a much better launching place.
Jamie, I'm sure you're familiar with this situation because the two of you talked quite a bit as you were looking at this. Is that a similar sort of what got overlooked in terms of your perspective?
I think our Yes. One of the primary skills that we put forth consistently is about listening. Do you know how to listen to the constituents that you serve? So in this case, one of the things that I think we missed was listening more carefully to the challenges that the superintendent perceived to be facing. And after the fact, the context that we heard was that the year before, in the first year of this superintendency, the same day, same thing that was happening, first kickoff day, the keynoter that he had hoped would come got sick and couldn't come. And so in scrambling to fill the time, the union leaders asked if they could be the keynotes. He agreed. And they kicked off with some pretty harsh language about the district, about what the district can't do for them, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and thus creating a whole like, hey, this is great, to everything's terrible kind of feeling from it. So it scared him. And so when they asked again this year, when Graig went, could we speak? He said no. That as an example of he has an idea of what he wants, but he didn't know how to listen to them in a way that would help them reframe their what they're hoping to get across to their colleagues, so that it would set it up differently. And so this is such a great example of like, well, that really went so poorly that I'm afraid to do it again.
Well, and it's interesting because as Graig was also saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what might have gotten overlooked was you had these planning meetings. And maybe what wasn't discussed was, tell me about last year's or the previous year's sort of kickoffs, so that I could somewhat learn about how can I build on where you've been. And that may have yielded, let me tell you what a nightmare that was for the suit.
Even if he's already said no, this reframes how Graig walks in, right? So if he knew it reframes his opening.
Right.
And what an obvious question to ask, right? And that we missed, right?
But it's so important. Yeah.
I was so confident of like, I know how to do an opening school event. You told us what content you want. I've done this 100 times before.
Yeah. Yeah. So in this case, your walk-up song was like a sad trombone.
Oh, 100%. 100%.
Actually, I'll tell you, to give people an idea about thinking about how do you facilitate and think about your audience's mindset, I changed my entire opening on the fly. And the one thing that I did that I don't even think that people in the room could anticipate how I did it was 1,000 people in the room. I made them all move because I wanted to break up their physical space because there's so much physical tension in the air. And there were so many people that were like on the edges of the gym and everything. And I was like, I need everybody to move to make space for the people. We're going to have an inclusive environment because that's what the superintendent just said. And taking that 5 minutes out of my presentation, which I was time limited on, to make sure that everybody moved meant that there was a little break and a little physical change.
That's really powerful.
Affective in a nutshell is, just being attentive to the group dynamic and being able to understand what will help support lower the affective filter. So people are at least open to an idea. Otherwise, I'm too angry to even it'll take everything I have just to sit.
In the end, the workshop's not magic. Like what we did.
Don't get to the end yet. Hold on. I want to know one question before we get to the end. What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed?
That's the question, right? And the end of this doesn't have anything to do with the workshop itself. The end of this ends with these two relationships. One, the union boss, who I didn't know previously, walked up to me afterwards and started talking to me. And we had a great conversation. And then he ended with, "That was pretty good." And I'm like, I'll take that.
That's a step up from my mother, who says, like, this isn't bad. Like, how about this was good?
Right.
That pizza, that wasn't bad.
Yeah.
And I knew I had to debrief fully with the superintendent, which we did some of immediately after I talked to the union boss, and we did some of it later, as a week later. And that relationship now of the superintendent being able to receive the feedback, rethink some of this, and work with us as coaches means that the most important relationship is that he's not just contracting with us to do something that he doesn't know how to do, but he's contracting with us to get him better at doing what he needs to do.
That's pretty powerful. So yeah, when my question typically is at the end is, so what was something that was good that came out of that situation? And what I think I hear you saying is, this wasn't a one and done. This was a launch. It could have gone better. But in the end, the relationship with that superintendent, and particularly because you had been in a room with 1,000, you didn't have to keep introducing yourself or who is this Graig guy or what is this like equity collaborative that you're bringing into the district? They all got to see you. And you sort of raised your level of credibility with them because they knew that you were speaking to them and recognizing that they got into this profession for all the right reasons.
Yeah, exactly. And that ultimately, we're not going to be in front of the 1,000 teachers again. And in fact, I hope that even though I want them to continue contracting with us, we're not their professional developers. They need to be their own professional developers. What we need is that relationship with the superintendent and his leadership team to help them be able to do next year what we did this year.
Yeah, that's interesting to see how they might be able to plan to have the teachers run that keynote again.
Exactly.
This time in a much more collaborative, shared leadership way that demonstrates the sort of empathy, compassion, and the work that you're trying to sort of infuse that exists, but you're trying to amplify.
For what they're trying to do together, right? Isn't that the purpose of us all working in the district?
Absolutely. When you've got this sort of hierarchical approach to leadership, then you're sunk. When you really do approach this from a shared leadership model, not, I'm going to tell you something and I want you to share it with others. That's not shared leadership, right? It's really, truly being able to say, you know what, your idea is better than mine. And that's the whole purpose of the group.
We usually say this, like, the only reason why you'd have a staff meeting is so that people could talk to people. Why are you using a staff meeting to tell people stuff? That's silly. You have all these brains in the room. Use that.
My guests today were Graig Meyer and Jamie Almanzán of the Equity Collaborative, and I am so grateful for your time today. I had so much fun talking with you, and I know that this will not be the last time we interact with each other. Our paths will definitely cross again. Thank you to you both.
Thank you, Peter. This was
so
great.
Much. A lot of fun.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print-inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader. I'm Peter Stiepelman. Please join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader. Leadership in After Action.